All right, we're joined now from Moscow by socialist writer and friend of the show, Egor Kotkin. Egor, welcome to Rising.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, Emily.
And so, Egor, without running you afoul of any Russian laws around patriotism or whatever they are now, I think it's to set the context for this conversation. I think it's fair to say that you have long been a skeptic of Russian President Vladimir Putin, and also quite skeptical of his decision to launch this war. And I think that's important context for this conversation. We wanted to have you on both to talk about what's going on in Donbass now, but also about potential resolutions of this conflict. And so to start, you recently tweeted this. You said, actually, in retrospect, Putin already made impossible resolution of the conflict with Ukraine without territorial concessions by one side or the other. Way back in 2014, accepting Crimea as a part of Russia, something that was not accepted neither by Ukraine nor by the world. And so so in other words, when Putin annexed Crimea, he set up a situation whereby any resolution to this conflict is assumed by both sides to leave that status quo. In other words, he's gonna keep Crimea. Nobody really seriously believes that he's going to give back Crimea, which means territorial concessions are going to have to be made to end this conflict. So what do you think the implications of this are?
Well, there are two kinds of implications. Immediate ones with regard to arm help to Ukraine from the West, because there is a condition in, I don't know how formal it is, but it was pronounced that arms that delivered to Ukraine should not strike Russian territory. Whereas at the same time, Ukrainian side often mentions that liberation of the territory of Ukraine includes not only Donbass region, but Crimea. And as they see Crimea their territory, and they might see it's a legitimate target for the weapons, including Western weapons. For Russia, it will be almost certainly, certainly it will be an attack on Russian territory and Russian citizens, because Crimea is constitutionally a part of Russia for 8 years. And despite the fact that it was certainly an annexation that will happen in Crimea, it was, nevertheless, it was a peaceful one. Whereas taking it back to Ukraine means war and victims from the side of population of Crimea. That's short-term implications, and it must be addressed by the Western countries that help Ukraine with weapons. What they position about Crimea, because again, if they rightfully, in my view, think that this weapon should not be used for transferring war on the territory of Russia, it includes Crimean question as well, and that puts West in the hard position to make a decision about Crimea de facto and de jure, at least de facto, because for 8 years it was ignored, but right now the decision has to be made, or otherwise there is a real risk that the war will be transferred on this territory.
What's important about your point is that you're saying it's already been made impossible, which renders a lot of this conflict, or puts it in a very different light. And I'm curious what you think, if you think Western leaders understand the impossibility, basically, that argument that you're making. Do you think that Western leaders, from President Biden, do you think President Zelensky, do you think people truly understand the dynamic that you describe in that tweet?
I think the Western leaders have the big problem of denial of history. I mean, this Francis Fukuyama notion of 30 years ago about the end of history, it didn't mean that history actually ended, but it manifests the main line of thinking of the ruling elite of the West for this 4 decades. They would like the history to end, and they refuse to think historically, and they refuse to make therefore they refuse to decide the side of the history they want to be in, and this leads to kind of schizophrenic politics, actually. And the Ukrainians being frustrated by this schizophrenic politics because they see on the one side wish to help Ukraine, on the other side they see a hesitance to help Ukraine, and Russia sees this too and uses for its strategic purposes. Though I don't agree with Putin's strategic purposes in any kind, I must admit that he has strategy, whereas West refuses to have strategy, and it's the big problem that current generation Western leaders have no historic approach at all. And they try to manage problems that can be managed without historic overall.
Right. Can you give us a little bit of sense of how the Russian economy is doing from the perspective of the Russian public, and also how has the Russian public's attitude toward Putin's war evolved since February?
Well, I'd say we see kind of a normalization of the situation because news becoming redundant, they repeat itself. So people being more concerned by the immediate problems. Prices are going up, that's undeniable, but all of these economic sanctions, they don't have immediate effect. They have a long-term effect. So right now, I can't say that people, on the short term, it mostly agitate people against the West, and people are being, actually it moves the focus of attention of people from what happens, Russian people, from what happens in Ukraine, from the framework of Russian-Ukraine conflict to the framework Russian-Western conflict, because all these companies withdraw from Russia, and it might not have an immediate economic effect, but it has a grandiose propagandist effect.
No, go ahead.
Basically, people rallied behind the flag the same way like it happened in America after 9/11.
Yeah, and that I think also, do you see Putin's perspective on people in Russia's support for the war? How do you think he views the public? I mean, because we know, just implicit in the idea that there's a massive propaganda campaign to justify the war. We know that Putin values public support, but if that starts to crack, how do you think that impacts Putin's decision making?
Well, it's hard to imagine how it will crack in the short term, because first of all, it's been reinforced from the outside. I mean, right now, the Western blockade is not as much helping Ukraine, as much helping Putin, creating like outside exoskeleton for his regime, because their actions basically show people that there is no alternative for Putin and Putin's regime, because West, as it manifests in their actions, is determined to crush Russia. And it doesn't matter what the real intent of the West is. I believe there is no clear intent. That's my main critique of the absence of the strategic intent or understanding on the part of the West. But from the inside of Russia, it seems like Putin was right all the time, and without Putin, Russia will be crushed by the West. So in that sense, support for Putin being reinforced by Western blockade on the one hand, and on the other hand, I should say that this whole special operations, as a law requires me to say, wouldn't start ever if Putin wouldn't successfully took over control of the Russian state, Russian politics for these 20 years. So this is like it's a result of these 20 years of him concentrating power in his hands. So right now it's kind of late to speak about a dissent from the populace of Russia, because if it was possible, the special operation wouldn't start. It started because the dissent was made for 20 years impossible, and elite dissent is a different thing, but because of the sanctions that target to the elite as well, it's also unlikely in the short time.
Yeah, always interesting. Yegor, you're writing on Patreon now, is that right? Yegor
Yes.
Kotkin?
Egor Kotkin, yes, on Patreon, and I'm going to write a new piece about future Ukraine and Russia relations. Where should be historic to put this historic perspective and to work a back strategy from this, and maybe I'll start my new videos on Patreon. So.
Well, people can find your work there until Patreon decides to shut down in Russia, or then you have to move somewhere else, right? But Egor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back with more Rising after this.